Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into one of the strangest corners of medieval life. A world where even cats could be put on trial. Yes, you heard that right. In the Middle Ages, justice didn't just belong to people. It sometimes extended to animals, too. Villagers gathered by candlelight to judge creatures accused of stealing, sorcery, or simply bad luck. It's a tale that's equal parts absurd, fascinating, and quietly human. So before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these calm dives into forgotten history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing the little map of night owls and history lovers around the world. Now settle in, dim the lights, maybe light a candle if you have one. Let the soft hum of the world around you fade, and let's step together into the flickering glow of a medieval courtroom, where the accused just might have whiskers and a tail. The cat, the court, and the village, how medieval justice worked one paw at a time. Of cats, chaos, and the curious nature of medieval law. It's late evening in a small medieval village somewhere in the French countryside. The year is roughly 1327, a time when the air smells faintly of wood smoke, dung, and damp straw, when roosters crow at all hours, and the rhythm of life follows the toll of the church bell rather than any clock. In this world, the concept of law is both familiar and foreign to you. It exists, but not in the tidy, printed codes of modern courts. Here, law lives in the voice of the local priest, the gossip of the alehouse, and the shifting moods of the lord who owns the land beneath everyone's feet. And strangely enough, it sometimes applies to animals. In these early centuries, the medieval mind did not always draw a clear line between human and beast, sinner and creature. Animals could be accused of crimes. Pigs might be tried for trampling children. Dogs could be executed for biting. And yes, even cats could find themselves summoned before a village court to answer for supposed crimes against order, morality, or property. You might be wondering, how could anyone possibly try a cat? The answer lies in a worldview so alien to modern thought that it almost feels mythical. To a medieval villager, the moral universe was universal. Every living thing had its place, and if a creature disturbed the natural or divine order, it could be punished like a human. The cat, in particular, stood in a curious position. On one hand, cats were useful, excellent hunters of rats and mice, crucial to the protection of stored grain and food. On the other, they were creatures of the night, independent, aloof, and often associated with witchcraft, heresy, and bad luck. A black cat crossing one's path wasn't just superstition. It was seen as a possible messenger of the devil himself. Cats were loved and feared in equal measure, sometimes cherished, sometimes burned. Imagine, for a moment, the heart of such a village. Narrow mud lanes winding between thatched roofs, a communal well at the center, and the looming wooden stockades of the manorial court at one end. The court was not grand. A wooden table, a stool for the bailiff, and a few benches for the peasants who would act as witnesses or jury. On certain market days, this court might convene not for a human quarrel, but to decide the fate of a creature, a goat that ate too many cabbages, a dog that killed a chicken, or a cat accused of consorting with a local witch. The proceedings were often ritualistic and deeply serious. There are recorded cases, yes, genuine historical documents, of cats, pigs, and other animals being formally charged, provided with defense counsel, and sentenced to punishments that mirrored those of humans. These were not jokes to them. They were expressions of cosmic justice. Every act, even by an animal, was believed to echo through divine law. If a cat caused harm, intentionally or otherwise, the order of the world demanded restoration through judgment. Now, you might imagine this as a cruel absurdity, but to understand it fully, you must imagine living in a time when mystery and faith filled every shadow. When disease might strike without explanation, when a drought might destroy your crops overnight, and when every misfortune seemed like a punishment sent by God, or worse, a trick of the devil. Justice wasn't just about human fairness. It was about balance between heaven and earth. A misbehaving animal wasn't just a nuisance. It might be a sign of moral decay or demonic influence. And so, trials had to be held, confessions sought, and penance given, even if the accused could only meow in response. Consider the small Burgundian village of Autun in 1386. There, a sow was executed publicly for killing a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes and hanged in the town square. It was not unusual, it was expected. The ritual demonstrated to the community that order had been restored, that justice, even divine justice, was impartial. If a pig could kill a child, then the pig must die as a murderer. The same logic extended to cats, whose crimes were sometimes more metaphysical, suspected of carrying curses, serving witches, or defiling sacred spaces. In the records of ecclesiastical courts, cats were sometimes burned alongside those accused of witchcraft as symbols of heresy. During the Feast of St. John, in certain parts of France, people threw cats into bonfires, a ritual meant to drive out evil spirits. These acts were often justified by the belief that cats harbored demons or carried the spirits of the unbaptized dead. It sounds horrific now, but in their world, it was a way to make sense of chaos, to burn away what was dark and uncontrollable. But not every village was cruel. In many places, cats were indispensable allies. Farmers valued them. Millers welcomed them. Even monks, though wary, often tolerated cats in monasteries to protect sacred manuscripts from gnawing mice. There are gentle images in illuminated manuscripts showing monks stroking their cats beside candlelight, both creatures content in the dim glow of devotion and routine. Yet even there, the dual nature of the cat lingered, a creature both sacred and suspect, friend and familiar. To grasp why cats could end up in court, we must understand how local justice worked. The medieval manorial court was both judge and spectacle. It was led by the lord's steward or bailiff, assisted by villagers who served as jurors. Punishments ranged from fines and shaming to corporal punishment and exile. The court was less about fairness than about maintaining harmony. It dealt not only with theft and trespass, but also with moral offenses, adultery, gossip, or neglect of communal duties. The village court was the spine of medieval order, and its judgments shaped the rhythms of rural life. Within this fragile framework, even a cat could become part of the machinery of justice. If a cat was blamed for bad luck, say a failed harvest, a sudden illness, or spoiled ale, it might be brought before the court as a scapegoat. Symbolically, punishing the cat was a way to cleanse the village of guilt or corruption. The idea that guilt could attach to a creature might seem absurd, but in a society that saw divine signs in everything, it made perfect sense. In some cases, animals were given extraordinary legal rights. A 15th century lawyer named Bartholomew Chasseneur even defended a colony of rats accused of destroying barley crops in Autun. His argument? That the rats could not be expected to appear in court because the journey would be dangerous, given the presence of cats along the way. The court accepted the plea, and the case was adjourned. The absurdity of this is easy to laugh at now, but it reflects the seriousness with which people treated even symbolic justice. The law, even at its most fantastical, was rooted in a profound desire for order, a way to understand and repair the fractures of daily life. When you imagine the medieval world, it is easy to think of knights and castles, of banners and battles. But the real history of those centuries was written not in bloodshed, but in these small, earnest attempts to keep the world from falling apart. A cat in court was not a joke. It was a reflection of a society struggling to draw boundaries between sin, nature, and justice. The fact that they bothered to hold such trials says something oddly beautiful about human need. The need to name, to judge, to make sense of mystery. Picture, if you will, the scene at dusk, villagers gathering by torchlight, murmuring as a cat sits in a wicker basket near the wooden bench. The steward clears his throat. The priest mutters a prayer. The baker's wife clutches her rosary. The air smells of hay and ash. And as the accused blinks slowly, tail curled around its paws, the proceedings begin. Someone speaks first, perhaps the miller, complaining that ever since the cat was seen near his grain sacks, rats have grown bolder, not fewer. Another swears the creature was seen on the roof during a thunderstorm, a sure sign of witchcraft. The priest nods gravely, reminding all that the devil takes many forms. And yet, someone else, a child perhaps, speaks in defense, but it only catches mice. It's my friend. The crowd hushes. Justice must be served. But what is justice when its subject does not understand its own crime? For the medieval villager, it was not the understanding that mattered, but the ritual. The rhythm of accusation, defense, and sentence reaffirmed the moral fabric of the community. Whether the cat was punished, exiled, or simply released, the act of judgment itself brought relief. The village could exhale again, believing that the strange misfortunes of life had been named, faced, and corrected. To us, it seems almost comic, a theater of superstition. But to them, it was the slow heartbeat of civilization, the echo of divine order made visible in straw and mud. Yet one cannot help but wonder, did they ever feel doubt? When the priest cast the sign of the cross over the trembling creature, when the bell told the sentence, did anyone look away? Did anyone whisper, perhaps this isn't right? It is that small flicker of doubt that makes this history more than absurd. It makes it human. And so the question lingers. In a world where justice was sacred but blind, who truly stood on trial? The cat, or the people who judged it? The rituals of guilt in the theater of law. Morning arrives over the same small medieval village, wrapped in mist and routine. The church bell rings from its squat tower, marking prime, the first canonical hour. Peasants stir from their straw beds, the smell of smoke and stale ale lingering from the night before. For most, it is another day of toil. For a few, however, the day holds unusual tension. The cat trial is set to resume. It may seem odd to think of a village court as something ceremonial, but in truth, it was one of the few structured public events that broke the monotony of peasant life. The arrival of Judgment Day, whether for man or beast, carried an air of drama and sanctity. After all, the court was not just a legal body, it was a religious theater. Its purpose was to remind everyone, from serf to shepherd, that justice flowed from divine order. The manorial court, or curia baronum, convened in a small wooden hall or, more often, in open air near the Lord's granary. The presiding steward would sit upon a crude dais, holding a ledger of cases, while 12 or so villagers, known as the homage, served as the local jury. Their role was not to question divine justice, but to affirm it. Before the hearing began, prayers were recited, invoking God's presence over the proceedings. And then, quite matter-of-factly, the bailiff would read the accusation aloud, even if it concerned a cat. It would sound something like this. Let it be known that on the feast of Saint Remigius, the cat of the cottage near the mill was found guilty of disorderly behavior, bringing ill omen upon the harvest, and thus disturbing the peace of the Lord's domain. The villagers, nodding solemnly, would cross themselves. To them, this was not ridiculous. The line between sin and misfortune was fine, and the church taught that all creation groaned under the burden of the fall. If a drought struck or milk soured, perhaps something or someone had offended God. Justice, even against a cat, might restore harmony, but the law had its own rhythm. The steward would call for witnesses. Sometimes 3 or 4 would come forward. One might swear he saw the cat sitting upon the church roof during Vespers, a bad omen. Another might claim it hissed when holy water was sprinkled. Others might simply whisper that its presence made their hens lay fewer eggs. Every statement, no matter how trivial, carried moral weight. Medieval courts were less about evidence than about confession and ritual purification. The villagers were not seeking truth in the modern sense. They were seeking equilibrium. If a wrong had been done, they needed to name it, ritualize it, and close the wound through punishment or penance. Yet, the accused was not entirely without defense. The law books of the period, such as the Coutumes de Beauvaisis, outlined that any creature under trial was entitled to representation. The Church, in particular, insisted on this point, not because they believed animals had rights, but because they believed justice must be seen to be whole. If even a cat could be granted counsel, it affirmed that the process itself was sacred, not arbitrary. Thus enters the figure of the procurator animalium, or advocate for animals. This was often a local notary or cleric, well versed in Latin, who would stand on behalf of the accused. The arguments they made were often technical, but surprisingly rational for their age. A procurator might argue, for instance, that a cat could not possess intentio malitiae, malicious intent, and therefore could not be guilty of sin. In other cases, he might plead that the creature was merely following its natural instincts, acting under divine design. These arguments occasionally succeeded. Animals were acquitted, exiled, or simply dismissed. In some archives, One can still find notes of such trials. In 1474, in the Swiss town of Basel, a rooster was tried for the grave offense of laying an egg, believed to be a diabolical act. The court, finding the creature guilty, sentenced it to be burned. But in another case, a colony of rats was exonerated after a clever defense argued that attending court would endanger their lives due to the presence of cats along the way. These proceedings may sound absurd now, but they illustrate something profound: the medieval obsession with order and participation. Everyone, even beasts, played their role in the cosmic drama. It is tempting to laugh at these rituals, but one must remember, this was not madness. It was meaning-making. In a world where famine and plague could strike without warning, it was comforting to believe that there were reasons and remedies. A court case against a cat gave form to fear. It transformed the intangible unease of misfortune into a story, a sequence, a conclusion. And stories, after all, are what keep communities sane. The villagers attending such trials rarely doubted their necessity. To them, the court was a moral hearth, a place where chaos was tamed, even if only symbolically. The act of gathering, speaking, and witnessing was as much about communal reassurance as about punishment. In that sense, the trial of a cat was no more absurd than modern rituals of bureaucracy or public ceremony. It was the medieval version of control, dignity, and catharsis. Still, there were undercurrents of unease. The church itself maintained a complicated stance toward animal trials. On one hand, theologians argued that animals lacked souls and moral agency. On the other, exorcisms and blessings were routinely performed upon livestock, fields, and even insects. The contradiction reveals much about the age. It was an era that could hold faith and contradiction side by side, without flinching. To the medieval mind, logic was a flexible thing, shaped by scripture, folklore, and fear. And then there were the cats themselves. To them, of course, none of this mattered. They prowled the same alleys, hunted the same mice, and dozed by the same hearths, indifferent to the human debates swirling above them. To the onlookers, however, the cat's indifference might be read as defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the court's authority. If it blinked slowly or flicked its tail, the crowd might whisper, "See, it mocks us." Superstition thrived on silence. But not every case ended in death. In some villages, the accused cat might be banished symbolically. A parchment would be read aloud declaring its exile, and the animal would be released beyond the village boundary. In others, the creature would be handed to the church for purification rituals, sprinkled with holy water, blessed, and declared cleansed. And in a few recorded cases, the cat would simply vanish before sentence could be carried out, an event later whispered about as proof of its infernal cunning. By afternoon, the villagers would drift back to their routines. Someone would feed the chickens, another would draw water from the well. Life, for all its moral theater, continued in the same slow rhythm. What the cat trial truly accomplished was not legal clarity, but psychological release. People needed to see action, however symbolic, taken against the inexplicable. A cat could not explain the blight on the barley, but its trial could make that blight bearable. You can almost picture it. The stillness of the hall after everyone is left, the faint smell of tallow candles, the the scratching of quills as the clerk records the verdict. A line of Latin seals the case into history, destined to perplex future generations. Outside, the cat's shadow moves across the thatch roofs, vanishing into twilight. The world feels balanced again, if only for a while. And yet, as centuries passed, these trials began to fade. The Renaissance and Reformation slowly eroded the belief in cosmic justice. New forms of law, shaped by Roman jurisprudence and emerging scientific rationalism, began to replace the old customs. But the echoes lingered. Even into the 17th century, villagers in rural France still whispered about cats as agents of misfortune, and priests still blessed barns against creatures of the night. Today, when we laugh at those records, those sober, ink-stained ledgers describing the prosecution of beasts, we see not stupidity, but yearning. The yearning to order chaos, to find pattern in pain, to believe that fairness could be applied to all things. And in that yearning, perhaps, we recognize ourselves. Because though we no longer put cats on trial, do we not still search for someone, or something, to blame when the world goes wrong? When the harvest fails, when the job is lost, when illness comes uninvited, don't we, too, seek a culprit, however abstract? The medieval villagers may have looked to their cats. We, perhaps, look to algorithms, systems, or chance. Different names, same impulse. And so, as the last candle flickers in that ancient courtroom and the cat's soft paw steps fade into the mist, one must wonder, was the trial ever truly for the cat, or was it for the people desperate to believe that justice, however absurd, could still be found in a world ruled by chance? When the bell tolled for cats, superstition, survival, and the long tale of medieval justice. The cat's trial is over now. The verdict, though unrecorded in any surviving scroll, lingers in the whispers of the village. Maybe the creature was burned, or perhaps it was exiled to the forest. Maybe it simply escaped through the thatched rafters during the night, never to return. Whatever the outcome, the village feels strangely lighter in its absence, as though the tension that had built for weeks has finally been exhaled. The air smells of rain and wood ash. The miller hums again, and the baker's wife, who once feared the cat's gaze, sprinkles her dough with salt and thinks no more of it. But the story doesn't end there. Not for the cat, and not for Europe. Because the centuries that followed the age of cat trials would teach humanity a dark and ironic lesson. Sometimes, the superstitions that make us feel safe can turn on us with terrible precision. The decline of the feline reputation. Throughout much of medieval Europe, cats suffered a slow, symbolic downfall. The church, in its zeal to root out heresy and paganism, began associating felines, especially black cats, with witchcraft and the devil himself. Papal decrees, such as those during the reign of Pope Gregory IX in the 1230s, helped cement the link between cats and satanic worship. His Vox in Rama, a papal bull issued around 1233, described a supposed heretical cult that venerated a black cat as a demonic idol. The document was as much political as theological, but its echoes rippled through the centuries. Before long, cats became collateral damage in the war against superstition. In countless towns and villages, cats were killed during witch hunts, thrown into fires during festivals, or driven from communities believed to be cursed. The justice that once sought to maintain divine balance now transformed into fear. Fear of the unseen, the uncontrollable, and the unexplainable. Ironically, the very animal that had protected humanity's food stores for centuries became the scapegoat for invisible evils. Cats were seen as vessels of witchcraft, and so they vanished, culled in the thousands across France, Germany, and England. Entire populations of cats were eradicated, especially during the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. It was a moral panic cloaked in piety. Yet, nature, as always, does not tolerate imbalance for long. The return of the rats. It is one of the most tragic and poetic turns in history. With fewer cats to keep rodent populations in check, the number of rats across Europe exploded. Grain stores, ship holds, and monastery cellars became infested. And along with the rats came the fleas, tiny, black, and seemingly harmless. But inside those fleas lived a bacterium that would soon change the course of human history. Yersinia pestis, the cause of the Black Death. By 1347, the plague had arrived in Europe, carried by ships docking in Mediterranean ports. Within 5 years, it would kill nearly 1/3 of the continent's population. Entire villages were wiped from the map, streets filled with the sound of bells tolling for the dead. And yet, in many places, the connection between the cat's disappearance and the pestilence that followed went unnoticed. To the medieval mind, this was not ecological consequence, it was divine punishment. The people had sinned, and God was reminding them of it. There's a cruel irony in that a society so obsessed with justice and divine balance had, through superstition, undone its own equilibrium. The very creature they had feared as diabolical could have been their savior. Had cats been allowed to thrive, the rat populations might have been tempered. Disease might have spread more slowly. But fear had its own logic, and logic is seldom enough to restrain fear. It's almost as if the cat's trial was a rehearsal for the great trials to come. Trials of faith, of science, of survival. Humanity would spend centuries trying to understand cause and effect, to separate superstition from truth. And even now, the echoes of those medieval fears remain faintly audible, like a bell tolling across the ages. Justice, reconsidered. In the quiet of the present day, when we read about these trials in dusty records and academic footnotes, it's easy to dismiss them as quaint relics of ignorance. But perhaps it is better to see them as mirrors, reflecting the human desire to explain suffering. When something terrible happens, when crops fail, when storms destroy, when disease strikes, we instinctively search for order. We tell stories. We name villains. We build rituals around the things we can't control. For the medieval villager, a cat could become the focus of all that fear and hope, a tangible embodiment of the mysterious and the divine. Punishing it was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was, in a strange way, an attempt at healing. The trial restored moral certainty to an uncertain world. But it also reminds us of how easily that instinct can turn inward, how quickly justice can become superstition. The same process that once put a cat on trial for witchcraft could, in another century, put a woman there instead. And so it did. The medieval cat trials were, in many ways, precursors to the great witch hunts of the early modern era. The courtroom rituals, the testimonies, the fearful logic, all carried forward, only with new victims. Still, not every corner of Europe succumbed to this pattern. In some places, particularly monastic communities, cats continued to hold a place of quiet reverence. Monks, pragmatic as always, understood their value. In the scriptoria of northern France and the British Isles, cats roamed freely, chasing mice that threatened precious manuscripts. There is even a famous marginal note from an Irish monk in the 9th century, written beside his illuminated text. Pangorban and I at work. My white cat and I together. Each of us hunts for something. He for mice, I for words. That little poem, both tender and mundane, captures what the courtroom could not: coexistence. It shows a kind of justice that needs no ritual, no punishment, just understanding. The monk and his cat live in parallel, each pursuing his own small truth in peace. Perhaps that is what the villagers of old were reaching for, too, a kind of peace. The law was their attempt to grasp meaning, to declare aloud that even the smallest disturbance had a place in the grand design. They could not yet see the invisible microbes, or trace the path of fleas, or weigh the complexity of ecosystems. But they could tell stories, and stories were their science. From judgment to symbol. As centuries passed, cats slowly clawed their way back into favor. The Enlightenment brought with it a more rational view of the natural world. The cat transformed from a witch's familiar into a companion of philosophers, artists, and solitary dreamers. By the Victorian era, cats appeared in paintings, parlors, and poetry as emblems of grace and domestic serenity. Queen Victoria herself adored them, helping to popularize their return as respectable pets across Europe. Still, the memory of their darker reputation lingered in folklore and fairy tales. Even in modern language, traces remain: catty remarks, bad luck, or curiosity killed the cat. The cultural memory of guilt is long, and the feline, ever elusive, carries that history in its silence. But if the medieval cat could speak, if that small creature once placed on trial could address us now, what might it say? Would it meow in mockery or in mercy? Would it forgive us for centuries of misunderstanding, for the flames, for the fear? Perhaps it wouldn't say anything at all. Perhaps it would simply blink, turn away, and walk into the dusk, as cats have always done, independent, self-contained, untouched by our desperate need for meaning. Reflection, the quiet lesson of the cat trial. In the end, the story of the cat trials is not about cruelty, nor even about absurdity. It is about the human need to create patterns, to place blame, to restore order in a chaotic world. It is about our endless attempts to name the unnameable. When you think of that medieval courtroom, the straw-covered floor, the murmuring crowd, the nervous priest clutching his cross, it's tempting to smile at the foolishness of it all. But then, think of how often we do the same, though in subtler ways. We blame luck or destiny or each other when life's mysteries confound us. The tools have changed, but the impulse has not. The cat, indifferent as ever, remains the perfect symbol of what cannot be judged. Its presence in our homes today, purring beside us as we read or drift toward sleep, reminds us of a truth the villagers never quite grasped, that not everything in life demands a verdict. Some things are meant to be watched, accepted, and left in peace. And so, as the candle gutters and the parchment closes on this quiet tale of law, superstition, and fur, you might ask yourself, if justice in the Middle Ages could try a cat, what unseen rituals do we still perform today, convincing ourselves that the world makes sense when perhaps it never truly will?